This is the video lesson on Mark chapter 4. In Mark chapter 4, we begin to see Jesus teach in parables. Now, there are parables scattered all throughout the Gospels. In all four Gospels, there are, depending on what you classify as a parable, between 35 and 50 parables. There are only, however, 8 in the Gospel of Mark, and this chapter contains 4 of those. So it starts with the parable of the sower, one of the most famous of Jesus' parables, and perhaps the most foundational and most important of the parables. Jesus says to the disciples, if you don't understand this parable, how will you understand the rest of them? So Jesus begins to teach in parables, and he starts with the parable of the sower. Now, in these parables, Jesus uses very common images and makes these marvelous spiritual points and lessons from them. It is one of the brilliant things about the teaching of Jesus. The illustrations and the examples are very commonplace, and yet Jesus draws remarkable lessons from them. So let's look at this first parable, this very important parable, the parable of the sower. There was a farmer who went out to sow his seed. And it fell on different kinds of soil. It fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. It fell on rocky ground, and it sprang up quickly, but there wasn't much soil, so it didn't really endure. It fell among thorns, and it grew up, but the thorns choked the life out of the plant, so it didn't bear fruit. And finally, it fell on good soil and bore 30 and 60 and 100 times. And Jesus says at the end of the parable, let those with ears to hear listen. So when the disciples got Jesus in private, they said, Master, that was interesting, but explain to us exactly what that meant. And so Jesus begins to talk to them about parables, and he says something very interesting. He says, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. In other words, Jesus says, I am going to explain to you the secrets of the kingdom of God. The disciples must have thought that a remarkable opportunity. But of course, what that means is that we are also hearing these explanations, because the Gospels contain not only Jesus' parables, but oftentimes the explanations of them. So we too are in the position of hearing Jesus reveal to us the secrets of the kingdom of God, and that's a remarkable opportunity that we have, and one of the wonderful things about the Gospels. So Jesus begins to explain this parable. He says the farmer is sowing the word. He is sowing the good news, the message. He is preaching. He is proclaiming. And it falls on different kinds of hearts. The path is like where the word is sown, but the devil immediately comes and takes it away, so the person doesn't embrace it or hear it or understand it at all. And we certainly understand this to be true. The good news is preached, the story of Christianity is told, and people simply don't embrace it whatsoever. He says, secondly, some of the soil falls on rocky ground. He said, this is like people who receive the word with joy, and yet when it gets a little difficult, they decide it wasn't quite worth the trouble because they don't have much root. And certainly in the experience of the church, there are people like this who embrace the gospel freely, and yet when it gets just a little bit difficult, they decide that maybe they made the wrong decision. Well, the third kind of soil is where the seed falls among the thorns. And Jesus says this is where somebody hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth and the desire for other things that comes in, and it chokes out the word. Well, of course, and we understand this very well too, that there are all sorts of things that can distract us in life, so that our life we get all caught up in the things of this world, and our life doesn't bear fruit for the kingdom of God. But finally, and here's the grace in this passage, and here's the promise, that the seed does in fact fall on some good soil. And when that happens, it does produce fruit, and it does so abundantly, 30 and 60 and 100 times. So that's the promise, and of course, the part of the point of the parable is to not be like the wrong kinds of soil, not let the thorns grow up in our life, but be like good soil and hear the word and embrace it. And if we do, our life will bear fruit. Well, Jesus then has three other parables that are all very interesting. First is, he says, is a lamp put under a bushel or under a bed? He says, no, you put it on a lampstand. And then Jesus says, remember, nothing is hidden, but it will be disclosed. Jesus seems to be talking about the final judgment here. In the final judgment, every secret will be revealed and everything will be known. Jesus says, therefore, pay attention to the way you hear, because the more those who have, more will be given them, and from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. So in other words, if you want to receive from God, then use and embrace what God gives you now. And the more you use your talents, the more you obey, the more you are obedient, the more God will increase your gifts, your abilities. God will give to you even more. The next parable is the parable of the growing seed. It is, and Jesus said, it's the kingdom of God is like somebody sowing, scattering seed on the ground, and you get up and you look at it, and day after day you watch it grow. It grows up, it sprouts, and you don't quite know how that happens. The earth makes it happen. It just happens of itself. And Jesus said, the kingdom of God is just like that. You can't exactly explain how it grows, but it grows and it develops and it produces fruit, and that is the work of God. Just like the earth causes the plants to grow and flower and bloom and bear fruit, so the Spirit of God causes His kingdom to grow in the world. And that's good news. That means it's not all up to us. Well, the final parable in this chapter is the parable of the mustard seed. The mustard seed was a plant in the land in the Middle East, the land of Israel. The mustard seed was very small, about the size of a period at the end of a sentence, and yet it grew into this large bushy plant that birds could nest in and they could rest in. And Jesus said, the kingdom of God is like this. It's the smallest of seeds, and yet it grows into a large bush, and the birds of the air make their nests in it, in its shade. So the kingdom of God may start very small. Its beginnings may seem very simple and small, and yet it grows into something very large that is able to give shelter to the people of God. And that's what the church does. It gives shelter to the kingdom of God. Well, there's one final story in Mark chapter 4, and this is the story of one of the miracles of Jesus. It is Jesus stilling the storm. When the evening had come, Jesus said to the disciples, let's go to the other side. So they get in the boat, they go to the other side. There are other boats with them, so that's an indication there would have been other witnesses to this miracle who could have confirmed it. And they get in the middle of a storm. And it says that Jesus was asleep in the stern, in the back of the boat, on a cushion. Now that's a curious detail when you think about it, and that is the kind of detail that the story doesn't really need. It doesn't really add a lot to the story except to say that Jesus is asleep, but it is the kind of detail that is told in real life stories as they are passed along orally from people to people. Small details like that are remembered and they are told because that's just the way the story happened. So this is a detail that gives authenticity and integrity to this story. Well, Jesus must have been exhausted because the storm's so bad the boat is filling with water. And the disciples are irritated and they're frustrated. They're all bailing for their life, and they say, Jesus, don't you care that we're about to drown? And Jesus is wonderful. He gets up, he rebukes the sea and the waves, and suddenly there's a great calm. And he looks at the disciples and he said, why don't you have any faith? And the disciples are just stunned. And it says that they were filled with awe, and they said to one another, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Who is this indeed? Well, again, a wonderful passage in a chapter in the Gospel of Mark, and we see that Jesus, again, does all things well. He has command over diseases. He has ultimate wisdom. No one ever catches him in his words. There's no question he cannot answer. And now we see he even has authority in the created order. The wind and the sea obey him. Well, read Mark chapter 4, and then we will see you in the video for Mark chapter 5.